people leave. I want to begin this morning with just a few announcements. I'm worried I'll forget if I leave them till the end. So, few things. First of all, I think I mentioned in here before that this group is going to be responsible, along with the men's and women's Bible studies, for providing food for our very first Friday of Lent after Stations of the Cross, which is on March the 7th, I believe, is that first Friday of Lent. So there is a sign-up sheet in the back on that table for people to bring. You can sign up for one thing. Like we're going to have salads, so you can sign up for one thing. You can literally just sign up to bring a little container of tomatoes, okay? Or sign up to bring croutons. But please, please, please consider doing that. There's also a sign-up sheet for next Sunday for those of you that want to make a breakfast casserole. So that's next Sunday, which will be March the 2nd. Is that right? Y'all, it's already March. It's already March. March the 2nd. So please sign up there as well. The other thing I want to tell you is that, let's talk real quickly about the retreat. The men's retreat, Greg has asked me to mention this morning that please sign up earlier than later. If you are wanting to do that, please go ahead and register. And that no one should not participate because of a concern about money. So if that is an issue, please contact Greg LaRue about that, okay? That is on March the 22nd from 9 until 3 p.m. The women's retreat on Saturday, March 8th is full. But I did have one person already notify me that they're not going to be able to be here. So if you'd like to grab that spot, you can call the office or let me know. Let me know if you want that spot, and I'll make sure it's there. Okay. One last thing. With Lent approaching us, does that sound scary when you say that? Lent is almost here. There are some little booklets back there on the back table. I encourage you to take one. This is for the Jubilee year. These are daily Lenten reflections that are written and provided for us with that theme of hope for every single day, okay? So please take one of those. There's tons of them. Take one for your friends if you'd like. I've got a whole nother box in my office, so please take some of those. All right, I think that's it. Have I covered everything I was supposed to cover, I think? Okay, good, excellent. So today what we're going to do is talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. We are continuing our journey with the journey through the parables of Jesus. We will meet on March the 2nd. That is next Sunday. I'll be doing the parable of the profitable servant. And then we do not meet on March the 9th, okay? Because I think that's spring break for a bunch of people. Not for me, but I think for somebody it must be spring break. So we won't be meeting on March the 9th. So today what we have to do is go into the 10th chapter of Luke today. And actually, I was so struck by something this morning. God's providence, I know, because I certainly didn't plan it. That the gospel reading was what it was today. Have I already been to Mass? Everybody been to Mass already? Nobody been to Mass? Okay. I won't give you a spoiler alert if you hadn't read the Gospels, but it is, of course, the beautiful reading about doing unto others, turning the other cheek, loving your enemy, loving those who hate you. And so today, it seems like this is actually lined up pretty well, that this is what we're talking about is the parable of the Good Samaritan, as you'll see. So today we're going to do, as I said, we're going to go into the 10th chapter of Luke and actually begin at verse 25, right? Actually begin a little bit before the parable begins to give some context for the parable. But before even that, it occurred to me, I've said this sometimes. I'm getting an echo. I'm going to move this down a little bit. Can you still hear me? Okay. I think it was too close to my mouth. All right. So you know me sometimes I'll say, okay, I need to give you the context. Well, today what I need to tell you is I want to give you context for the context. So let's don't just zoom out, let's zoom out just a little bit more. Because this is the portion of St. Luke's narrative where he has just described the sending out of the 72. Okay, so that's the context that's immediately preceding where this parable appears. And I'm going to read that part to you. It says, the Lord appointed 72, put a pin in that, we're coming back to that number. The Lord appointed 72 others whom he sent out ahead of him in pairs to every town and place he intended to visit. He said to them, the harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. So ask the master of the harvest, to send out laborers for his harvest. So, disciples, the Lord has sent them out. Now, depending on the Greek text that you read, there are 70 or there are 72. Obviously, our translation reads that there are 72, but the Eastern tradition, interestingly, holds to 70. And that's because the earliest translations of Luke's gospel in the Greek that appeared, for instance, in the Alexandria, Egypt region, were translated as 70. And so that is their tradition. Most of the Western texts say 72 that were translated out of that original Greek. And that's because, really, you can thank my friend St. Jerome for that, yeah? Because St. Jerome translated the Vulgate and said it was 72. Therefore, guess what? It is 72. You can just rest assured there are 72. That was the context I needed to give you for the context. Because then when you go down to verse 25, you find this. There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test him and said, Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? He said in reply, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. He replied to him, You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Okay, so there's that great commandment, right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your being, with all your strength, with all your mind. So, let's continue with the reading. This is a long little stretch this morning, but I do think it's important we hear the words, okay? Sometimes for me it's not enough to read them, I need to hear them. But because he wished to justify himself. Okay, do we need to go back? Everybody could make the bridge here. Jesus had already told him, You have answered correctly, do this and you will live. And what does the scholar of the law do? But, right? But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back. Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? He answered, The one who treated him with mercy. Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise. Okay? Do this and you will live. Go and do likewise. Okay, there is so much to unpack in here. I've decided, anybody need to go to 11 o'clock Mass? We're going to be here till about noon. I'm teasing. There is so much in here to unpack. The structure of this parable. There are certain words in this parable, you know, that I love to kind of dig into the nuance of the Greek, the original language, to see what the Lord might be telling us that is across time. Because remember, we talked about this when we looked at the very first parable we ever talked about in here, and every time since. We've talked about the fact that Jesus is speaking this obviously in a specific context, in time, to a specific people. The ancient hearer would have heard something in this parable that resonated with them immediately. And I think sometimes we are so far removed from that ancient hearer's context that it's good for us to at least get a sense of what that might have meant to them. Does that make sense? So there's so much to unpack here. The parable of the Good Samaritan is probably one of the most widely recognized, most profound teachings. If you ask on the street, go out and ask the average guy on the street, can you name a parable? Almost everybody's going to know this one. It's commonly repeated, it's commonly used, even I've seen it used in secular texts to teach philosophical principles. So it's widely recognized, very profound. It is a parable that illustrates so many different things. Love, mercy, compassion. There are two words here that I think we're going to unpack a little more: compassion and mercy. And it's mercy and compassion towards people, even people that society might see as someone on the outside, an other, someone who is unworthy or outside of our comfort zone. The story involves a man, clearly, who is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. He is attacked by someone, left for dead. Yeah? And let's go back and review this. Remember that the priest and the Levite both pass by and don't help him, don't even offer to help him. Do you notice that they pass by on the opposite side of the road? In other words, I don't see you. But a Samaritan, a member of a group who is despised by the Jews, shows compassion and tends to the man's wounds. But okay, that is the simple reading, right? Y'all ready to go? That's the simple reading. The parable better be raising some important questions for us. This is a parable that should raise important questions for us. Okay, so anybody want to guess who that artist is? Very good. It's not hard to tell, is it? What does it mean to love one's neighbor? That's a good question. What does it mean? How do social and even political ideas sometimes inform the way that we respond to other people? How does this story challenge us to think of mercy? So these are questions that should automatically come to mind for us, or one of these should automatically come to mind for us, hopefully at least one. And to get to that, to get to the answers to these questions, what we have to do is look at this in its historical, linguistic, in other words, language and structure, and also its sort of theological layers, drawing upon insights. You know what I like to do? I like to look at patristic sources. I like to look at how this is being interpreted today in modern themes, especially modern themes of Catholic social justice. How is this parable being interpreted in, for instance, what we hear from those in leadership, the USCCB? What do we hear in papal encyclicals across the 20th century particularly, which was one of the most challenging in history when it comes to, if you want to identify an enemy, look in the 20th century. It's not like we never had enemies before, but the century that preceded this one was so torn with conflict, right? And wrought with, war on mass scales. So I was interested to see, well, how did the 20th century interpret this particular parable in that context? And then I want to conclude kind of today with those kind of contemporary questions for us, because this parable is being spoken to a group by God Himself. It is God incarnate who is speaking these words. Therefore, these words have authority. Do they not? This is not some social teaching of the church that you can take away and say, well, I don't really think it means that. This is God himself speaking. And I think it's really helpful for us to frame everything we're going to say that way. Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? The parable appears in the Gospel of Luke, remember, after a lawyer tests Jesus by asking, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Okay? And then we get on down to the lawyer, the but, remember? But the lawyer who is seeking justification says what? And who is my neighbor? I want y'all to sit with that for just a second. You have just heard these incredibly powerful words about the law. This is what you must do to inherit eternal life. And the scholar of the law says, but who is my neighbor? Just to be clear, Jesus, who among all these people is my neighbor? In response to that question, who is my neighbor? That's the question. Jesus tells this parable. Yeah, you got the construct of it? The scholar asks the question, who is my neighbor? And then the parable follows. So let's look at how the text is structured. I think this is really interesting. There's actually several things about the structure of this that are interesting to me. The setting for this is from Jerusalem to Jericho. Okay. So is Jesus just giving us a geography lesson? What do you think? What do you think? From Jerusalem to Jericho. This is not, I mean, it's easy to read this kind of superficially and say, well, that's a well-known, well-traveled road of the ancient world. It was well known to be a dangerous journey to make from Jerusalem to Jericho. But that's what Jesus chooses to set the stage for the entire parable. To the ancient hearer, this would have resonated precisely because of its danger. Precisely because of its danger. The setting symbolizes a lot of things. Maybe it's not just a dangerous road. Maybe it also symbolizes all of life's challenges, yeah? Maybe we're all on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Metaphorically, right? That we're all on this journey that is a dangerous one. It doesn't just have to be a literal interpretation of this. And I suspect, since this is God speaking to us, I suspect it means a lot more than just Jerusalem to Jericho. Is this the road of our own human existence? Could anybody in here be this person on this road from Jerusalem to Jericho? Always facing challenges, even dangers sometimes. Sometimes we need the help of someone else. Would we stop to help a stranger ourselves if we are rushed for time, or we might not feel safe somewhere? This is a dangerous road. Nothing is by accident here. He's not speaking anything on accident. There's no coincidence. So it's not just for your geographical reference. And I want to make another point too, and I'll probably, if I have time, I'll come back maybe and look at this again. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho, if you do want a geography lesson, or how about a topography lesson? This is a descent. You're going from Jerusalem down to Jericho. It is a descent. So again, you can read that literally, or you could read this metaphorically. That maybe Jesus is speaking about those times when we are at our worst, when we need help the most, because we are on a descent. Do you see? So let's look at the characters in the parable. The man. The man could be anyone. It could be any of us. It could be any of you in this room. This is often interpreted as actually commonly interpreted, the man is simply all of humanity. If you want to read it that way. Wounded by sin, wounded by the injustices of the world, wounded by whatever the circumstances are that he finds himself in. The man can be anybody and any circumstance. The priest and the Levite, two religious figures who should have done what? Shown compassion. Their failure to respond to this man points to something else Jesus is teaching. And it's something that comes out time after time after time. For instance, whenever he confronts the Pharisees. Yeah? You hear the same theme when he confronts the Pharisees. What good is your religiosity, your outward piety, your observance of all the rules and all the order? What good is that if you have no compassion? And then there's the Samaritan. An unexpected person in this parable is the Samaritan. At least to the ancient Jewish hearer, this is unexpected. A despised figure in Jewish culture, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. I might talk more about that than you want to know, but I think that that's important historical context. You know, Deacon gave us lots of historical context on David this morning in his homily. So you're going to get a lot of historical context on the Samaritans and what this relationship is between the Jews and these people and why this would be such a despised figure. It's important to know. Otherwise, the Samaritan doesn't mean anything to us. Yeah? His actions are in obvious, stark contrast to what you just heard about what the priest and the Levite did, the indifference of this religious elite, their apathy. I would dare say, not only their apathy, but their refusal to see a person who needed something. The ancient Jews' disdain for the Samaritans actually begins, that artwork looks a lot creepier now that I see it up close and that big, okay? The ancient Jews' disdain for the Samaritans stems from a lot of things, okay? And again, it's very complex, so I don't want to go into all of it, but I think that just having a kind of a brief historical construct for this would be very helpful for you. It's not just historical, it's religious and it's cultural. The relationship between the two groups is pretty complex, and it goes back hundreds of years. From when Jesus is speaking this was hundreds of years old. From the time that, you know, as I said, he's telling it. Because if you go back to the fall of the nation of Israel, well, actually the fall of the northern kingdom, let's put it that way. The fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, okay? 700 years before Jesus is speaking this parable. The fall of the northern kingdom. The Assyrians, the conquering people, brought in foreigners who intermarried among some of the Jews that did not go into exile. Is everybody with me? So they intermarry into the Jewish people, and this new group, that's the result of the intermarriage of the Assyrians with the Jewish people of the northern kingdom of Israel, become known as the Samaritans, because they settle in an area that is designated even as Samaria, right? So therefore, you see, what happens is that the Samaritans consider themselves descendants of these people of the northern kingdom who had not been exiled. Okay? They had been allowed to stay in the land. They're mixing. So do you see how they see themselves, right? They are already different from who? The ones who were exiled. They're already different. And then you have, of course, they're mixing with foreigners, of course, leads the Jews who have been sent into exile, actually the ones in exile, and more importantly, the ones in the southern kingdom of Judah, which is where the capital city of Jerusalem is. That southern kingdom did not fall until a few centuries later. So that little kingdom lives on. Well, you've got Jews living in Judah who view them, the Samaritans, then as what? Impure. Is this making sense to everybody? Is this helpful to anybody? Okay, is it helpful to know? This historical event creates a deep sense of animosity between these two people. The Jews considered the Samaritans to be impure, a corrupted version of their own people, if you want to think about it that way. Not quite like me. Do you hear tones of that? Not quite like me. Even though this was a historical circumstance centuries old, the hearer, when Jesus spoke these words, would have gone, when he said Samaritan, would have gone, well, who? What? A Samaritan? Not quite like me. So one of the central, I mentioned historical differences, one of the central religious differences between these people, between Jews and Samaritans, was their approach to the worship of God. While Jews considered the temple in Jerusalem, especially this is true after the fall of the northern kingdom, they considered the temple in Jerusalem to be, of course, the legitimate place of worship. The Samaritans established their own religious center in their own city of Shechem. So there is automatically another kind of rivalry that's set into place. There were differences in their views of what were the authoritative Hebrew texts, for instance. Is it the Torah plus the prophets or not? Do you include the prophets too? Or is it just the Torah, the Pentateuch? This discrepancy in religious texts, it further fuels this kind of division between these people, their sense of separateness. So this hostility actually erupted into violence. In the 1st century BC, for example, we are told in the historical record, and there's chronicles about this, there are reports of Samaritans actually desecrating the temple in Jerusalem. And that's an act that led to violent reprisals by the Jews against the Samaritans. So do you see how this contributes to a long-standing cycle of hatred and distrust between these two groups? This is at the heart. And the reason I went to so much detail to tell you that, and believe me, I could have talked a lot longer about that, especially their religious differences. This is at the heart of why Jesus' parable he is telling is so radical. Like if you really get this, it's why it's so radical to the hearer. Because it takes the typical kind of Jewish understanding of neighbor and turns it on its head. Jesus uses the Samaritan, the very person who represented all of this hatred, all of this animosity for centuries. He uses that person, the Jews view with such contempt, right, as the hero of the story. Think about that for a minute. He's the hero of the story. And did he just stop to help the guy on the side of the road? Which would have maybe been enough, right? That would have been enough to make it a radical story. We're going to talk about the word radical too, because I love that word. What else does he do? Takes him to the end. Oh, continue. We're not done yet. Pays to take care of him, and then says what? We're not done yet. I'll repay you. Okay. And meanwhile, where are the pious and religious? His own kind? Well, they're down the road somewhere. They've already reached wherever they're going. But this person is the hero. Jesus has placed this person as the model in the story. You understand how radical this is? To us, maybe perhaps I should say not to us, but certainly to the hearer of this, all ethnic, social, political, religious divisions, Jesus has just transcended in this story. He's telling everyone, you need to do that too. Transcend all of these differences. It's so scandalous. I mean, this is the reason. Think about it. Think about another time when would have been scandalous. Is there another time that you can remember in the Gospels where Jesus encounters a Samaritan and the disciples are absolutely horrified? The woman at the well. The Samaritan woman. I mean, think of all the social conventions he violated by speaking to a woman alone doing a chore, number one, and she's a Samaritan. It's scandalous. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'm just going to let it sit and then we're going to move on. But I'm just going to, this is rhetorical. You don't necessarily have to answer it right now. But I think it's something we're called to think about. Who are the Samaritans in our lives? Who are the Samaritans in our world? The parable ends with Jesus asking, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The lawyer replies, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus then tells him, go and do likewise. So, early church fathers wrote a good bit about this parable, as you might imagine. But remember that one of the reasons I like looking at this is because the early church often weighs in on the teachings of Jesus, again, in a very specific construct. They're looking at them through the lens of the church. You know, like, what does this mean for the church universal, for the church Catholic? What is the teaching we can take away for everybody? What's the common theme for the church itself? So, for instance, one of the common themes that you find in all of the patristic sources, or not, I wouldn't say all of them, but most of them, is you find an early agreement that there's something very special about the reference to oil and wine. The oil and wine that the Samaritan uses to bind the man's wounds symbolize the sacraments of the church. Jesus is not speaking by accident when he says that the Samaritan uses oil and wine to bind the man's wounds. What does the church do but bind us up and heal us with the sacraments? Do you see? So that's kind of a very common theme in the early church. Baptism and the Eucharist primarily is, I guess, what you would take away with that, or the anointing of the sick. But this binding up of the wounded man on the side of the road, and Jesus specifically says that was with oil and wine. Okay. What about the inn where the man is taken? Where do you think early readers would have thought that? What does that represent? Where the man is taken, the inn. It's the church. It's the church. Where the wounded soul can be healed. St. Augustine interprets the parable kind of from a moral perspective. For Augustine, the story illustrates, he's always the necessity of charity. The necessity of charity, not in words, but in action. And he even says this, that charity is an action. It's not a mere thought or intention. It is an action. I'll talk more about that action in just a minute. The Samaritan's compassion is not just an emotional response either. He's not just going because, I feel bad for this guy. Because it's a concrete action that involves personal sacrifice. Yeah? Don't you think the Samaritan probably had business to do that day? He was on his way somewhere. He was going somewhere. But it's a concrete action. And it's not just an action to provide an immediate kind of assistance. It's an action that extends to whatever that person is going to need. Yeah? The long-term care, you want to think about it that way. The parable is a call, Augustine says, for us to imitate Christ directly. And that extends to all people, even those who might be enemies or outsiders. Now, St. John Chrysostom I love this. Oh my gosh, I love this because he focuses on, and he uses, of course, Chrysostom often wrote in Greek, so there's a little bit that might be lost in translation here, but he sees the radical, and the word I want to talk about, radical, is actually from a Latin root, that it's radical because of the Samaritan's actions. In several of his homilies, actually, that highlight this, Chrysostom talks about the Samaritan's mercy. This is more than just one homily, by the way. Is so radical that it cannot be of human prompting, he says. It's not something that we naturally do. Because, we're all busy. We're all going somewhere. We're all on this road. We're all on this journey somewhere, and we don't want to be bothered sometimes. Now, come on, can we be honest? I'll be honest. Do I always want to be bothered? No. I'm walking out to go to lunch, and a student meets me in the hall and says, I need about 10 minutes of your time. And I'm like, oh. Right? And that's nothing. That's nothing. But we all do that. Right? That's not just me, right? Is it just me? So what he says is this is not of human prompting. The Jewish audience would have found the actions of the Samaritan, an outsider and an enemy, to be so scandalous that Chrysostom says that it is the radical nature of this tells us that it's from a source other than us. Christ alone is the source of such good. Can only have one source because it is so radical. Okay, so today, more modern interpretations of the Good Samaritan kind of emphasize, actually bring to mind, I guess, the relevance it has to social teaching today in the 21st century. And the need to care for marginalized groups, people who are vulnerable, marginalized, the outsider. And how do you show love and compassion to people like that? In contrast to the more privileged groups, like the priest and the Levite. So in contemporary discussions, the parable challenges us to think about how or if, maybe, we extend mercy to our enemies, or those we perceive as somehow different than we are. Pope St. John Paul II put it this way, quote, "The Good Samaritan does not mind that he might be criticized for helping someone who has traditionally been an enemy. And he does not ask him questions, where he comes from, why he is there, where he is going. He asks no questions at all. Very simply, the Good Samaritan sees the injured person in need. He spontaneously helps him and takes him to an inn and sees that he receives all he needs to be well and whole again." The Pope concluded this way, "This is charity, a charity that makes no exception because of the other person's ethnic origin, their religious background, or political preference. No exceptions whatsoever." And he added the emphasis, not me. No exceptions whatsoever. The sociological, I want to talk just real quick. I'm going to use a fancy simple term. There's a sociological concept called the other. I talked about this before in here, maybe. The other. That's a real thing, by the way. I didn't make that term up. The other. The other. It refers to the way individuals or groups are defined or perceived in society. So there's a lot of study that, not my discipline, but it's a sociological concept, that a lot of study goes into looking at how particular groups of people are categorized in society, how we define them, where we put them, right? Everybody belongs in a little slot. And how do we perceive them as distinct? Like, how are you distinctly different from another person? And what this does, sort of sociologically, studies how then there becomes a dominant group, yeah? One that might be preferable to these other groups. The other is typically used to describe those people who are marginalized, excluded, are viewed as different in some significant way, in a significant way. And over the course of history, this is not just, and look, this is not 21st century weird academic speak, okay? Even if it sounds like it. It's not. This is something that sort of has been developed over centuries of studying of human behavior. It's a concept that helps explain how people construct social boundaries, how we assign value to certain identities over another identity. Yeah? There's always a potential danger for us to do this. We all do it. We all do it. Now, is it as extreme as what happened in the 17th century in the witch hunts of Europe? When you have the other, who is defined as the person who's the weirdo who lives in the village. She's probably a widow woman with no one to speak up for her. Yeah, but she's a little weird. So what do we do with the other? Historically, is it's easy to marginalize them. It's easy to even persecute them. That's the danger in all of this, is that we have this tendency to draw distinct identity boundaries around people. The other, someone who is not like me. That's the bottom line. Someone who is not like me. There's always a potential danger that we're going to do this, even among our own family of faith right here in the Catholic Church. So in case you think this concept, as I said, is just kind of fancy speak, it's actually what the scholar of the law in the parable. Let's go back and think about what he says. This is exactly what the scholar of the law is invoking when he says what? Who is my neighbor? Do you see what he's done? He's invoked this idea that there is someone who is not like him. Y'all get that? Why would he ask such a question if he had not already made a distinction between himself and others? Why would he even ask the question? People sometimes use the parable to argue for our moral obligation to intervene when others are in distress, especially in situations where there is an imbalance of power or there is a lack of resources. Think of some of the issues going on in the world today. I mean, this can become super complex if you start thinking about this on a global scale. But I don't think, and I don't want to get political this morning. I think I already have. This can be complex when you start talking about issues on a global scale. But I don't, and that's when I think we need to be more discerning and thoughtful and truly be informed by the teaching. But I don't think that even the complexity of something on a global scale abrogates the responsibility we have to hear the parable and to take that to heart. It does not abrogate us from our responsibility to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. It does not abrogate our responsibility to read this parable and take seriously our responsibility in Jesus' challenge here. Okay? Now, maybe that means dialogue at higher levels, dialogues involving lots of different complex factors, but it does not remove the obligation to respond to someone in need. This is a core Christian principle. So I want to tell you a story, a true story. I like true stories because they're true. A true story from Shreveport, Louisiana. It does not involve a priest, or 5 of them, even though the story is from 1873. I'm going to tell you a completely different story from 1873. Not a priest. Everybody knows what happened in Shreveport in 1873? You should. In 1873, there was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers lieutenant here from Iowa who was here during federal Reconstruction to clear the Red River. Now, I've just set the setting for the story, okay? What are the key takeaways you just heard? He is a young U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer from where? Iowa, who is in Shreveport, Louisiana during federal Reconstruction. Louisiana was occupied by federal troops immediately following the ending of hostilities. We were immediately occupied by federal troops, and as a matter of fact, it's the outbreak of yellow fever in 1873 that ends federal Reconstruction in Louisiana, okay? So this young U.S. Army Corps of Engineers lieutenant from Iowa was here with a very specific charge. The Corps sent him down here to clear the river. The work that Captain Shreve had done in the 1830s was great, but now we've got several decades that have gone by, and the silt and the buildup of the log jam is not as bad as it was in the 1830s, but the river is becoming less navigable. So they send him down here with a group of about 300 men, and that's their charge. He came in the summer of 1872, and this was his job, was to clear the river. His name was Eugene Woodruff. He was just 30 years old. I didn't tell you this part. I told you he was from Iowa. I didn't tell you he'd been an officer in the Union Army. He was a West Point graduate. Served with distinction in the Union Army. A Northerner. I heard somebody say Yankee. I'm not sure that we're really supposed to use that term anymore, but anyway. What can we all agree that he represents in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1873? He's the other. He's the other. He's an outsider. He was certainly not welcome in Shreveport in 1872, 1873. Now, although he never wrote about any of this, in his letters back home to his mother in Iowa, who I've seen all of them, he never wrote of this in those letters. We can assume he was marginalized, scorned perhaps, mistreated even. With certainty, he was the other. The wounds of the war were fresh. The enmity was still very much there. And all he represented. Y'all got the picture? Deacon?
Don't you believe, though, he probably considered us to Southerners
Yep.
marginalized? We also were. We couldn't govern ourselves, you know.
Right.
Supported slavery. We were probably the ignorant.
Much like the Samaritan would have viewed the Jew. We've talked a lot about how the Jews viewed the Samaritans. Think about how the Samaritan might have viewed the Jew. Thank you. That's an excellent, excellent point. Was it outside of Louisiana? Yes. Okay. But listen, this is important context. Because when he received orders from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to take his 300 men to safety when yellow fever broke out here, he was ordered to get them to Alexandria by riverboat. He was to get them to Alexandria to get away from yellow fever. He did exactly that. He sent all of his men south to Alexandria for safety. And he chose to remain in Shreveport and care for sick and dying strangers. People who saw him as an enemy, an outsider, someone not like them, he wrote a beautiful letter back home to his mother. We have it in the archives at LSUS, where he says, and I'm quoting, "I know you are hearing news of the pestilence in Shreveport. I am healthy. But more importantly, you must know that I am not the least afraid. The people of this town need me." He died of yellow fever in Shreveport, caring for strangers at the age of 31. The Good Samaritan. He saw suffering. He responded with mercy to the sacrifice of his own life. It's too bad he's a Protestant, or we might have another canonization cause. He wasn't a nurse or a doctor. He didn't go into the fever wards because he was a medical professional or he was expected to do that. He did it because he could. And he did. So there's a great footnote to that story that I'm just going to tell you. It has nothing to do with the Good Samaritan. But do you see the connection between the story I told you and the parable? So, thank you, Deacon, for making the point that probably Eugene Woodruff didn't like us very much either. But he responded. So there's this great story that some of you might have heard this before, but I was in my office one day at LSUS. I talked about him sending his men away, and one among those 300 men that went to Alexandria was his brother George Woodruff, and who went back to Iowa. And so one day I'm sitting in my office and this man shows up. We got a little pot of office. This man shows up. He's wandering around, and I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Well, I'm looking for Dr. White." I said, "Well, that's me." And he told me his name, Merritt Jones. It didn't really mean much to me, and I had gone to get Dr. Joyner by this point because he had a book in his hand, I think had Dr. Joyner's name on it. And anyway, it didn't mean anything to me. And he said, "I was wondering if you could take me and show me where my great-great-great uncle is buried." And I said, "Who's your great-great-great uncle?" He said, "Eugene Woodruff." He said, "His brother George was my great-great-great-grandfather." So he's a dentist in Iowa, private pilot, flew down here just to go see where Eugene Woodruff is buried. And it was one of those moments that historians live for, because you know what he said to us next? He said, "Oh, by the way," he said, "I have all the letters that you're missing in your archives. I have all of those. I have Eugene's West Point uniform, his sword, his class ring, and I have all of the stereopticon photographs he took of the Red River in 1872. Okay. All right, I better hurry up here. Okay. So there's other things, a few other things. I am wrapping up, I promise. To understand the parable a little more deeply, I think we have to examine a little bit more about this structure. Jerusalem to Jericho, I talked about that being a descent. Jerusalem is sort of associated with holiness and the temple, right? While Jericho is a more dangerous and a much more secular place. So again, it's not just a geography lesson. The man who needed assistance was on a descent, perhaps of his own soul. Yeah, his own soul is on a descent. Someone unexpected helped him and restored him. And then we have this word I cannot pronounce, splag. Can you pronounce that, Father? Splack? Okay. That's the Greek word that's used for compassion in this parable, and also Elios is used for mercy. The Samaritan's action is motivated by these deep Greek terms. Okay, let me talk about that compassion word first. The connotation to this is a verb. Did you hear that? It is a verb. It's not a response. Remember I said it's not a responsive emotion? It's a verb. It is an action. It's a visceral action that compels somebody to do something. It suggests a kind of empathy that goes beyond just recognizing there's a need. It's actively taking a role in alleviating it to the extreme. And then Elios is this the root of a word, one of the Greek words, few Greek words we ever hear in our liturgy. The Kyrie, eleison, mercy. When Jesus asked the lawyer which of these three was a neighbor to the man, the word Elios, eleison, the same root of that word Elios, is used, emphasizing the act of showing mercy rather than a simple judgment. Think of how we implore God in the Kyrie eleison. Think about how we implore Him, right? Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. The only part, so the same word in Greek. So reflect on that for just a moment. Theologically, Jesus is setting us up, is He not? The way that we implore God's mercy, that's what this Samaritan did for this traveler. How radical is this teaching? I love this word radical. It comes from the Latin word, because in the Latin, the church fathers of the West who wrote in Latin used the word radix, which in Latin means root. It's the same root, no pun intended. It's the same root of our word radish. Yeah? It's the same word. It's a root vegetable, yeah. But the word means root, to the root. It means to get to the very root of what Jesus is saying means to be radical. It challenges us to define neighbor the way we do in very limited terms, and instead calls us to be more like Christ. So I think it's relevant to a lot of things today. Think about it. Our interfaith dialogue, I could see this concept, it comes up in conversation sometimes. Migration, which is in the news a lot lately. All the issues that touch upon social justice that the church teaches us about. The radical nature of Christ's teaching, getting to the root of what he's saying, is to transcend all the things that bind us earthly. Do you know what I mean? All the political squabbles, all the things that we don't understand and the way that we look at each other as others, Jesus is calling us above that. Do we do it perfectly? No. Do governments do it perfectly? No. But the parable demands us to contemplate the kind of compassion that we read about or hear about. And I don't think that's an option, because how does Jesus end? Let me go back and look at that real quick, just real quick. What's the very last thing Jesus says to you? Go and do likewise. Do you see a question mark in there? Is it a suggestion? The language is an imperative. So yes, he has much, much to teach us in every single age. This is an eternal truth. And I think it speaks to the core of what we are as Christians. Okay, I'm sorry I kept you a few minutes. Well, actually, I did okay. It's 10:30. But I did plan to finish earlier, and then I got into my story about Eugene. But any questions of me? Father.
It's interesting that the scholar's question to Jesus was, who is my neighbor? Jesus doesn't directly answer that, because it works out that he's asking the scholar, who was the neighbor?
Right, right.
So the neighbor actually was the Good Samaritan in this story, and we are challenged to be that good neighbor.
Right. Right. So exactly. Jesus tells a parable. This is like, this would drive me crazy. When you ask a question and you get an answer with a question, right? But that's what a parable does, is it calls us deeper into that mystery. No, Jesus does not answer him directly. But he implies, therefore, it must be everyone. Because there's no group more dissonant or more different than the Samaritan and the Jew. So who are Samaritans today? Who are the Samaritans? Who's the other? All right, so, is everybody still speaking to me this morning? Next Sunday we'll be doing the parable of the profitable servant. That will be me up again. And then on Thursday the 6th, we do that first. I'm going to plug this because I really would like to get more people coming. It's called the First Thursday's Faith Formation. It's at 5:30 on Thursday evenings. We only do it once a month, so we're not asking a huge commitment. But we're doing this for the Jubilee year, this theme of hope. The talk I'm giving on Thursday the 6th will be the true hope of the true cross. And I'll be talking about the discovery of the true cross, the veneration of that relic, how we venerate any relic, and sort of what the church teaches us about the proper posture we should have toward relics. But more importantly, the true cross of Christ. So I hope that you'll come to that. All right? All right, guys, I will see you next week. Thank you very much. Please take some of these booklets back there.
Do you have 10 minutes? No.
I love that scarf.
Thank you. I think I signed up for...
Yeah, you did. I saw your name on there.
Double check.
I saw your name, yeah.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks.